A pleasure to meet y'all at last, and welcome to some more super foam flying. But let's just say that the Uinta, in terms of the Alpha Strike series, certainly ain't alone by any means. Considering how I went as far as to call it the worst Nerf blaster I've ever had in my collection, well, you know what? That's really saying a whole lot in just seconds at a time, but well, it's not alone here. We got a blaster that I've also talked about in my top 10 worst Nerf blasters that I have currently, which at the time, of course, took place in August 2021. But here we are now, a few years later, talking a little bit more about the Lynx. This blaster, of course, well, let's just say it was not initially made for American releases. Although because some reproduction models were sent out to most American marketplaces, including Kroger's lots, which actually was how I managed to get my hands on this. As soon as I got into a pick and save, there was a big part of an aisle that was dedicated to the Nerf Alpha Strike series, and this was among many of the Alpha Strike products that was just sitting there. I never thought I'd get my hands on this, considering how it was mostly meant for international release, but now that we have ourselves a reproduction model, I tell you, this one still does not necessarily have a whole lot to really go for it, other than the fact that, well, let's just say it's just a combination, well, part Hypnos for having a pump down below, part Sledge Fire for a breech that can open up, allowing you to put in one dart into a barrel, like that. And then, of course, it's also a little part stockade because of this little stock that allows up to 6 darts to be put in. Of course, I shot out an Elite dart, which had the Alpha Strike coloring on it of orange and yellow, but I got a few AccuStrike darts on here as well, just so you could basically get an idea of how exactly this blaster could work with most types of ammo. But I guess with that in mind does come quite a few things that I might as well readdress, just to make sure that everyone around here gets the message. This blaster really doesn't go as far as to meet any kind of expectations that we'd normally perceive very well. And it's probably for a good reason. Because, well, first of all, this is an Alpha Strike blaster. This was Nerf's way of trying to cash in on the big marketplace that was ever so growing with other brands out there, competitors like Adventure Force, Zuru, Buzzbee, and many others wanting in on the toy gun marketplace. Just the same as Hasbro's Nerf. But the thing is, this right here was one of the many initial run examples that went ahead to show that the Alpha Strike blasters were definitely not made for many of us. Hardcore fans all over the world do not necessarily need a blaster this cheap and therefore, well, this clunky, this cheaply made, this cheaply feeling. But at least for a reproduction model like this one in particular, which, like I said, I got it from a Kroger brand marketplace, a pick and save, so to speak, for only 15 bucks. You know what? That's a pretty good deal, at least. A $15 blaster with the likes of both the Hypno, Sledge Fire, Stockade, and a little, well, it's a permanently attached scope on top, but I would have considered it to be a little like the Long Shot, where the scope is very similarly designed, but it's a much smaller one. Not quite as bulky. But for the most part, I'm still going to go out on a limb to say that this one actually still is going to be a part of that list. Even though I might look at this differently as I grow older, I develop a little more wisdom and knowledge and acceptance towards a lot of other things there, there's always one thing that seems to come to mind every single time. Honesty. Of course, you're probably still familiar with the fact that the series Honest J Nowak is still running. It's going strong after well over 1,600 episodes, and that's certainly quite a long time that I've basically had since day one. I mean, if David Uttenreiter the guy who inspired me to do all of this just for you, is watching this right now, then you know what? You still are the true inspiration to this series, and maybe you deserve a little more credit than just simply being the guy who said the quote, "Honesty is the best policy." I really feel like that there should probably be merchandising based on this. After all this time, I never quite considered that, only because money has been a little scarce. And, well, budgeting is not necessarily in my favor. But again, for an Alpha Strike blaster like this, the Lynx merely being a mere tactic of a way to try and give us a different look here. For a reproduction model, this one at least does things a little bit better, but because of how small the stock is, I can't necessarily get a good, well, feel for it, considering, well, also these grooves right here. They're not necessarily good if you press it hard enough on your shoulder, and combined with the fact that, well, you also have a pump that's not necessarily very good at getting your grip. You have to pull back on it a little hard because of the way that the spring is a little tough in a way, but basically speaking, like, my hand can barely fit on this whole entire thing. I mean, I kind of have to hold my fingers down low, which is a bit of an awkward positioning, almost unnatural, almost discomforting in a way. If I were holding onto this for a long time, then that's probably a good reason for it, but again, I'm not necessarily going to tear this whole entire thing apart because, I mean, I do like some of the Alpha Strike blasters. I know I'm a fan of the Otter, which of course, as you can see, is right here, just underneath the holdout. Of course, they call it the Optic, but it's Otter. It's an Alpha Strike blaster. For a reproduction model, this did not get a name change, and I am more than just happy for that. Alpha Strike blasters are indeed named after things based off of zoology. When you really take a look at it, the initial run included blasters like the Cobra, the Fang, Wolf, Lynx, and what do you think they are all based off of? Zoology. This is one of the first run blasters at the time. And then, of course, there was the Stinger, which, of course, could relate to bees, wasps, yellow jackets, hornets. But because there was a dart tag blaster called the Stinger, I had to change that name as well to Spinneret, a part of a spider that is used for making webs. So, that's pretty much just the end of that. But the Lynx here... Oh, darn. Yeah, you basically got to keep both hands on the blaster here, otherwise the barrel might come apart like that. It's not very good at keeping itself together, unfortunately. But I'm not really going to tear the whole entire thing apart just because of how it functions or how it supposedly does what it's supposed to do as a blaster entirely. But let's also not forget that this, again, it's an Alpha Strike blaster. So of course there are going to be a lot of faults and limitations that Hasbro's going to have just to get this thing out to the marketplace. Cheap plastic, no screws and the like. That's probably what has let a lot of people down because they want to modify the blaster itself. But also, let's not forget that the caution labels that are still in embossed text, they still say do not modify darts or dart blasters. And that's certainly because that's probably the reason why Hasbro has decided to stop putting screws on a bunch of newer blasters, because they feared that their customers would take the blasters apart and modify them against their own rules. So, again, I'm not necessarily going to ever be angry about that, because you know what? Modifying toys to be killer weapons, in real life that is, would be a horrible idea. But if I were to give this blaster a score, then well, let's just say it's also a bit average, like many blasters out there that I've already talked about this whole time, with a score that I might as well say could probably be, at most, 5.9 out of 10. I wouldn't necessarily call it a great blaster, but I would also not call it a very bad blaster. It still does retain its ranking upon that top 10 list, with the top 10 worst blasters that I've ever had. So in a way you can basically look at it in most ways, and you might necessarily look at it as being, well, not very good of a choice, a good pick for something like that, but again, there's always a reason for something like this, and there's also always a reason to have a blaster, at least to talk about in some way. So that way you can at least find what pick would be better or what could even be more worse. Other than that, I'm not really going into any further detail on it whatsoever. So that's just going to be the end of that part. But if you want to see more go down on my channel, then make sure that you like, subscribe, comment, follow me on social media, and stay on the Hollywood side.